25th, 1986. And for the oral history project of Historic Madison, I, Lorraine Orchard, am talking with George Extrom, who will be assisted by Dorothy Daggett, Mrs. Ronald Daggett, both in Madison. We are interested to know the relationship between the Taychopera Foundation and the origin of Historic Madison. And because George Extrom has the background for the Taychopera Foundation, I'd like to know if he could give us a little information about it. And first, George, I don't know whether to pronounce it Taychopera or Taychopera. I can spell it because I'm looking at your paper. It's Taychopera, and the official title is Taychopera Foundation Incorporated. Now, can you tell us something about dates and purposes?
First, there was always a debate on whether that should be Taychopera or Taychopera. It's an Indian name. I think it means the Four Lakes or region of the Four Lakes or something like that. And I always maintained that since it was probably written down phonetically from the Ojibwe, I believe the Ojibwe Indian language, they wouldn't have used CH if they meant it to be pronounced Taychopera. I was a very small minority of people who believed that. That incidentally was also the name of the Central High School annual for many years.
Remember that.
The early meetings were held in March or the spring of 1968. I think the original idea came from Mrs. Audrey Parkinson, who was a graduate student in municipal planning, urban and regional planning. And at their organizational meeting, whose minutes I have here, the members present were Mr. Robert Murphy, Mr. Walter Scott, Mr. Walter Jacobson, Mr. William Redden, Mrs. Elizabeth Redden, Mrs. Audrey Parkinson, Mrs. Dorothy Daggett, Mrs. Jill Marks, Mrs. Phil Lewis, and Mrs. Mary White. And this meeting was to consider proposed articles of incorporation, and some of the items are marked for change from the original in the meeting. It talks about the name and the purposes and membership in it and that sort of thing. I don't know what else there should be said about the first meetings. There were later on, the nominating committee was
prompted, I believe, that historic Mapleside
was
to be torn down. That was what one of, you could just tell it, that was one of the things, and that prompted the Landmarks Commission within a few years.
Very early on, people discovered that unfortunately a historic home in Madison, Mapleside on University Avenue was to be torn down and be replaced by a hamburger stand. This had been the first, well, the farmhouse on the first farm that produced crops in Dane County. Abel, I forget his name. And it was made of sandstone from the Shorewood Hills quarries just across University Avenue, and was well over 100 years old. Some people became concerned that it was going to be destroyed and decided to try to save it, and the ordinance was proposed to the Common Council to organize or create a landmarks commission which would designate historic buildings for preservation. That was one of the original purposes of Taychopera, and I believe it was one of the best things they did. They accomplished that. Mayor Dyke was an enthusiastic supporter, and in fact, a newspaper clipping says he signed the ordinance with a quill pen provided by the State Historical Society.
I remember there was a lot of publicity about this in the papers, and I remember the house.
But it was a real spin-off.
I recall when we tried to raise money to save Mapleside. The first plan was to save it where it was, and then it was proposed, since we were not making much headway that way, in fact had failed in the month allowed to raise $50,000 or $60,000. We didn't raise the money. It was proposed then to take it down, move it to the Arboretum, and set it up again. And an architectural firm in Madison offered to have its staff do all the marking and rearranging or for keeping it in order for $1. But that failed too. Some of the interest is shown by a woman who sent in a poem about it and said we should sell the poem and use the money to help preserve Mapleside. The stones have been piled in the Arboretum, I believe. I don't know if the marks are still extant or if anybody knows where they are, but it was never rebuilt, of course. But it did give some impetus to this drive for a landmark commission, which usually designates that a building so selected may not be changed externally from its original shape or form. Inside you can do what you want. That was successfully passed when, about 1970?
73 over there, did you have?
75? No, it's 67?
67. Was it?
No,
that
no,
wasn't
this was-
Taychopera, that was another
We didn't
effort.
meet till 68.
No, we didn't meet
I
till
think it was
68.
several years. One thing that might be of interest is that at the last meeting, to really preserve Mapleside was held in our home, and we spent about 3 hours trying to convince Burger King to use the home as it was, be forerunners in preserving, and still have their fast food chain. They were flabbergasted. Now that is done, there are many communities where a company will come in and say, we'll preserve it, we'll contribute this to the history of your community, and we will still make hamburgers. That
By the
failed.
way, Burger King gave $2,000 toward the restoration fund.
Wow,
Forgotten
good.
that. Right.
So there probably is a possibility, isn't there, if the stones can be found and then that it could be
I think
rebuilt
so.
in the Arboretum, for
I'm not-
example?
I'm not sure whom we would ask.
Right.
Suppose the Arboretum people know where they are.
Yes. Well, then that gave you the impetus to get started.
Yeah.
And then you incorporated after that.
Well, it
And
was probably incorporated just before that. I don't have the dates on
well,
the
probably when we search through these papers, we might get those dates established. Thanks. All
I
right.
want to be on the tape. People wondering who I am.
All right. How do I stop this temporarily?
about Professor Daggett. I have a picture of that in the file there.
There are a whole series in that booklet.
Well, you became established, and I'm sure accomplished. I know of several things. And, can you tell us what your big accomplishments were in your view?
In addition to the Landmarks Commission and the Ordinance, I think the greatest accomplishment was the saving and moving of the old synagogue, Gates of Heaven Synagogue, which formerly stood where the Valley Bank stands on West Washington Avenue, block off the square. Money was raised, and it was moved to its present place in, is that James Madison Park, where it sits?
Yes.
And with some contributions of artifacts, I guess you'd call them, in a Christian church that would be called a reredos, but it is some kind of a wall panel that came from a Jewish synagogue in Milwaukee. Incidentally, this Gates of Heaven Synagogue is the second oldest existing building used originally as a synagogue. The other one is in is a very famous one in Rhode Island. That and there were several booklets published about historic Madison, walking tour guides and study of some of the homes. These were prepared by Jill Marks.
There still are walking tours, and I imagine those guidebooks are still in
Yes,
use.
they are.
I think Historic Madison conducts those now, doesn't it?
I believe so.
Well, I noticed you have a clipping here. It says, "And let's save the old red gym too." Did Taychopera get into that?
No.
Or you didn't have to?
This is a letter from to the newspaper, a newspaper, from a university student saying that student who just returned, as a student who just returned from Europe, I was thrilled and impressed with all the old buildings in every country. And this person says we should save the old red gym. In fact, there was another letter inspired by this that I seem vaguely to remember that claimed that people come from miles and miles away to look at that old building. And nothing was done by Taychopera, and I don't know if it ever became a formal proposition for them.
Mm-hmm. That title might be good in these, in addition to what you said, because that hasn't been done.
Oh, yes, these booklets I spoke of. I'll read right from the article. During its 7 years' existence, Taychopera published several booklets, selected historic buildings for inclusion in Sandstone and Buffalo robes, a walking tour guide to Madison's historic downtown buildings, and financed Jill Marks in making films of historic places in the city. Other booklets issued by Taychopera included Madison Houses 1837 to 1915, prepared by Mrs. Marks, several colored films of Madison's historic places, and a pamphlet devoted to the concept of a historic district in the Gilman Street, Wisconsin Avenue area. That became a fact, too.
Yeah.
Yes, it did.
It used to be called Big Bug Hill.
Right.
That's right. And now we still have, as we said, tours and articles about those homes and renovation.
Oh, there was one other house that we were interested in. Excuse me. On Gilman Street at near Wisconsin Avenue. It was called the Bashford House, I believe, and it was an Italian style. It had a kind of a tower in the corner of an L-shaped building. It was proposed that be purchased as an investment. It had 6 or 8 small apartments in it, and the idea was that by buying it, we could preserve it for one thing and have a source of income for promoting our work also, but that also became financially impossible and was never done.
We did sell note paper with sketches of the Bashford house, which George has just mentioned, the Keenan house, the Pierce house, and the Herfurth home, and also the Old Spring Tavern, owned by William Stevens. Now, one of these is a bed and breakfast.
Luxury.
Pierce house.
Yes, yes.
That'd be the way to preserve them all.
You're too modest, Dorothy. I imagine Ron Daggett designed the note paper. Is that right?
Right.
I have seen those,
Illustrated
yes.
booklets.
And did he illustrate the booklet too? His sketches have contributed so much to Madison and our history. Well, is there anything else about the history of Taychopera we should include before we start to talk about its relationship with historic Madison and the origin of historic Madison?
I only can remember the interest there was in the moving of the synagogue. I think it cost $20,000 to move it, and they did it without taking it apart. They wrapped cables around it. And what happened, my office was on the 6th floor of a building right at the corner where they moved it, so I had a good spot for taking some pictures. And a contractor came in, and it took parts of 2 days. I remember crews going along Dayton, what street was that? Dayton Street, and clipping tree branches and moving light fixtures. And everybody walked along beside it or followed it along expecting it was going to collapse, but it didn't. And one thing that amused me during the discussion of raising money, which we did, we raised enough money to move it. Somebody suggested that since this was the Gates of Heaven Synagogue, one of the ways to raise money would be to sponsor a golf tournament and call it the Gates of Heaven Open. That was never done, however.
No. Was there anything else about Taychopera?
Only when we begin to talk about historic Madison, and we're going to talk about the dissolution, the last thing they did was to appropriate $500 for installing ornamental double doors on the synagogue, and $125, some reports say $200, for an oil painting of Mapleside, which is in the possession of the Madison City Library.
Good. Oh, and I see from this article that watercolor sketch in Mapleside was done by Margaret Mansfield of Waunakee, and it's here in the library.
Yes, it used to hang in the
Right.
Arts and Music. Yeah, I don't know, I haven't been there since they changed the function of the library.
I've thought of one thing that I'm aware of in retrospect here, that I think we were very conscious of public education and of giving talks to organizations, and I don't think there's a better way to circulate in Madison to educate the public, and I think it's something that shouldn't die. If there's something going on in historic Madison or in any of the groups with goals to preserve history, that is still one of the better ways, maybe the best, to talk with people, to answer questions, and to educate.
Now, you have here an article written by Frank Custer, who says in 1975 that Taychopera Foundation was disbanded after 7 years of work. And this is certainly an important article to retain, it seems to me. And do you remember why you disbanded, or any of the details that you could relate for us, George?
Well, strangely, I cannot really remember clearly why we disbanded. There seemed to be failure enthusiasm after accomplishing the landmarks ordinance and the moving of the synagogue, and the membership fell as a result, and so it was felt that since a new organization seemed to be being proposed, which was interested in the history, not necessarily in preservation. I think that was the principal difference between historic Madison and Taychopera. Taychopera was interested in preservation, historic Madison in history.
That's good.
But as it worked out, a number of Taychopera members went over to historic Madison, including Gordon Orr, who had been president of Taychopera at one time, and became a board member, and I don't know but what he was a president at one time.
I think so.
So there was a continuity in membership between them. One of the discussions, or some of the discussions, were between the questions of merging or simply dissolving. And Robert B. L. Murphy, who was backbone really of the organization, giving his legal talents to our problems as well as his well-known interest in history and historic preservation, had the feeling that their goal was not the same as ours, and that the money, which was really all that was to be involved, should better be marked for use in continued preservation. And I cannot now remember how much there was left. The proposal finally was made that the money be given to the Historical Society with some strings attached to it, for 5 years, that it could be redesignated for some other similar organization who had similar aims to Taychopera, and if that sort of thing didn't arise in 5 years, then it would go to the Historical Society. And I believe that's the way it worked out. No further organization was formed with that purpose, and so the money went to the society. This is a notice that I sent out as president in June of 1975 to members, and it clarifies some of these questions and objectives and accomplishments. So I'll read it. From my notes and recollections of our committee meeting on June 4th, I have prepared a summary of the considerations we want to submit to Historic Madison Incorporated. I would appreciate your confirmation and corrections of them. Then I will ask Gordon Orr to name a committee from his group to meet with us and discuss the subject of merger, probably on June 17th or 18th, if the dates are convenient for you. First, we propose that Taychopera Foundation Incorporated merge with Historic Madison Incorporated. You will recall a few minutes ago I said that we had decided against it, but this was preliminary to that decision. We propose that if a merger is agreed upon, the treasury which Taychopera would bring should be made a separate fund from all other monies of Historic Madison Incorporated and administered by a separate board of trustees comprising former members of Taychopera who are also members of Historic Madison. The name Taychopera should be preserved in the title of the fund. The fund plus proceeds from its investment and additional given to it should be devoted to activities and functions closely related to historic preservation. A change in the bylaws of Historic Madison should be enacted to include as one of its purposes the aim now included in the Constitution and bylaws of Taychopera. We will explore the possibilities of requesting the addition to the fund, Taychopera Preservation Fund, as voluntary contributions and as a fixed portion of each member's dues. Other assets which Taychopera will bring are the films made by Jill Marks, the photographic display made by Chris Barnes, that's Mrs. Robert Barnes, any books, magazines, subscriptions, and association memberships we have at the time of merger. We should keep in mind the possibility of establishing the trust fund ourselves before merger if no alternative seems possible to ensure continuation of Taychopera. This, as events turned out, was not done. The merger did not go through because of this disagreement or lack of congruity of aims between the two organizations. So the dissolution went on instead of merger. And there are records, historical legal records problems that are covered by these papers, letters. I don't know if it would be interesting to the general reader. As I say, the merger did not go through because of the difference in goals, but there was certainly no resentment or animosity, as is proved by the fact that Gordon Orr, a former president of Taychopera, was, I think, the first president of Historic Madison. At least he was the person to whom we turned when we were discussing the merger. And there were other members on their board who had formerly been on our board and had formerly been members of Taychopera. Historic Madison has thriven, and we left our mark in the synagogue move and the landmarks ordinance in the city, and I think that was really when interest began to fade, when we had accomplished what our stated goals were. And it seemed that by that time there were real estate people in Madison who became interested and began to look at their buildings and think about their buildings with respect to preserving the older ones and, in fact, getting the shelter of landmark designation. One of the first that was designated was the Fraternity House on
Sigma
Prospect, Sigma Chi
Sigma
on
Chi.
Prospect Avenue.
Sigma Phi, excuse me.
Correction, I apologize both to Sigma Chi's and the Sigma Phi's.
Right, let's get it right.
That was, I forget the name of the architect, not a Frank Lloyd Wright building, I believe. It was a firm in Chicago.
Is that a Sullivan house or not?
Sullivan,
I think
yes,
so.
Sullivan. Although it was actually done by one of his people who later moved to Madison. And that was designated, and the plaque was designed by a member of our organization and paid for by our organization, in fact. And there was some consideration being given to other houses. The Pierce House is outstanding when it comes to mind, which has now been made into, as Dorothy said, a bed and breakfast building. And others, I'm sure, have been influenced. In fact, we may claim, I think, some connection with that Victorian garden that was built on Gilman Street. And I forget the cross street there at that corner, but people were aware in that neighborhood there on Yankee Hill or Big Bug Hill, there were a lot of homes of the same era, the first homes in Madison, which deserved preservation and recognition, some of which have received them. The question of the maintenance of the records of the Taychopera Foundation was covered in the second paragraph of one of the articles of incorporation of Taychopera, and it reads, and I'm reading from it: upon dissolution or final liquidation of this foundation, its assets shall be distributed to a successor or comparable foundation if there be one in existence, and if there be none, to the State Historical Society, Wisconsin. Distribution to the Society shall be expressly conditioned on the administration and retention of such assets for a period up to 5 years, during which the Society shall be authorized and encouraged to convey such assets to an organization generally similar in its aims to this foundation, including an organization created by or on the initiative of the said State Historical Society. Assets so distributed to the Society shall not be subject to further conditions after the completion of such 5-year period, but may be used for purposes as determined by its Board of Curators. And that's the end of the article on dissolution.
Well, George, I certainly thank you. You have a wealth of material here. Your articles of incorporation and many newspaper articles, correspondence, old programs, minutes of all your meetings in a thick notebook. And this is exceedingly valuable material. And from your last remarks, we'll know where you think it's all going to end. And I'm sure people from Historic Madison will be happy to be able to refer to it. Right now, you just turn to a list. I gather those are charter members or contributors.
1971.
In 1971.
71 membership list.
Membership, a long membership list, and there will be many names on there that we will find familiar.
As I recall, organizations have to have 200 members in order to use a mailing permit for a charitable group, and I believe we made it. Not by much, but we made it. So there were around 200 members.
Well, I thank both you and Dorothy, and I can't help observing that you really sowed the seeds that are now bearing fruit. You may be dissolved as a formal organization, but you transferred a lot of your enthusiasm to Historic Madison through the overlapping of members. And we just have to look around in Madison now. Look at the gates of heaven. Look at the landmark homes. And look at the garden on Gilman Street. And we know that you have influenced public opinion. And perhaps your mission was done, although you might see a reason to reorganize if something doesn't go right.
Well, it was a great experience for anyone interested in the history of Madison, and there are not very many of us who are lifelong members of Madison, I guess, from I find, and we want to preserve it the way it was when we were part of it, part of its beginning.
Wouldn't I die if it wouldn't? But with you here, I just relaxed.